G'day, I'm Dan. Welcome to Van Diemen's Land Model Bench, and today we're going to review the Iwata HP-CS Eclipse. Okay, so here's the packaging you get with the airbrush. On the front you can see it's part of the Iwata HP family of airbrushes, of which there are quite a few. This is the Eclipse edition, and this is rather important. You'll see later on when we look at how the front of the airbrush is arranged. On the side here we've got some suggestions about what this might be useful for, including obviously our hobby here and doing model cars and things. And then on the back we've got an illustration of the airbrush with a few of its features highlighted. So for example, this airbrush comes with a 0.35mm needle and a fixed cup on the top with a 10cc capacity. Being a dual action, of course the trigger goes down and back, and we also have a cutaway handle at the rear so we can pull the needle backwards and forwards. Let's take the sleeve off. Okay, we've got the branding there again for Iwata. Then inside we've got two things. We've got a sticker, and we've also got a quick start guide. Very basic instructions basically about how to attach your air source, your air hose, where to put the paint, and how to start airbrushing in the most basic form of push down and pull back for paint. Inside, some basic instructions on cleaning, suggesting you use your appropriate cleaner for your medium. We also have mention of a couple of features which unfortunately are not included in the Eclipse version of the HP airbrush. So one of them is a preset knob, and the other one is a MAC valve. Down the bottom we've got some distributors around the world and how to contact them, and then on the next page we have the instructions repeated again in Japanese, as indeed we do on the back as well. Inside the box we've got three parts. We've got our Super Lube, which is Iwata's branded airbrush lubricant. We also have our spanner, and we have the airbrush itself. So let's take a look at the airbrush. And with all Iwata airbrushes it is beautifully finished and it's very bright shiny chrome. Now I've used this a couple of times before the review just to get a bit more familiar with it, but all their airbrushes come in this sort of trim, or this sort of finish if you like. So here for example is another one of the Iwata branded airbrushes I own. This is the HPM single action, and you can see it's got a similar finish, and that's been, I don't know how many months old now, it might be nearly a year old, and you can see it still looks great. So the airbrush itself, fairly standard for Iwata. We've got quite a large paint cup, as we said in the back there, 10cc, and a bit of a sticky lid. There we go. Quite a wide mouth there to the cup as well, so no problem getting your paint in there and giving it a stir if you need to. The other thing that's characteristic of Iwata airbrushes, I'll just bring that up towards the camera, you can see there, is it is actually quite easy to get down to the very base as well. So if you're cleaning your airbrush and you want to get a paintbrush down there just to clean around the bottom there, it is actually quite easy to do. And the width of the cup here means that you can get a paper towel with a bit of airbrush cleaner on it and very easily get in there to wipe it clean. So I really like that, that's really nice. All Iwata airbrushes are made to incredibly high standards. The trigger mechanisms on them are just superb. You really won't find fault with how they work. They're very smooth, very easy to use, very controllable, which is one of the reasons I really love this brand. Going back towards the rear there, we've got our cutout. This allows us to pull the whole needle back if we want to. So this can be handy sometimes if your airbrush should clog. You can pull it back a couple of times to try and unclog it. You don't get a quick change valve or assembly to go on your valve here. So if you want one of those, you'll have to buy that separately. But there are plenty of them out there, including Iwata's, or if you want aftermarket ones for a couple of dollars. Going to the front of the airbrush, this is where things are a little bit different compared to most Iwata airbrushes, and the reason why I got the Eclipse. Now, to give you an idea what I'm talking about, this is, as I said, the Iwata HP airbrush, and this is a single action airbrush, but the front of the airbrush is fairly atypical of Iwata. So first of all, we have a guard that goes over our needle, which also is on the Eclipse. But if I unwind this part here, nozzle guard, you can actually see there's the nozzle and the needle sticking through it. And it is incredibly fine. It is very fine. So if you get a clog and you need to take that nozzle off to clean it, you need to use one of these tiny little spanners. And the risk is, of course, that if you go to take it off and put it back on, that you may cross-thread it, or you may over-tighten it. And if you should do that and snap it, then you can have all sorts of fun trying to get the remaining part of the nozzle out of the thread. And if you can't achieve it, then you're going to have to send your airbrush away to be repaired, which can be rather expensive. Also, Iwata spare parts are not cheap, so you don't want to do that if you can avoid it. And that, to be honest, is what I think is one of the main things about the Iwata brand I just don't like. The good news is these nozzles don't get blocked very often. So typically it's not something you have to undo every time you work with your airbrush, for example. If you flush and clean your airbrushes regularly, then you won't be doing this very often at all. I think I've probably done it once on this airbrush since I bought it. But still, it's always in the back of your mind that that is a very delicate part, and if something goes wrong, you're going to have your airbrush out of action, which will be a problem if it's the only one you've got, and it could cost you a bit of money. Similarly, this one here, which is my Tamiya airbrush, which is the Superfine HG, and by the way, I've got reviews of both of these airbrushes up on my site if you want to know more about them. This is a 0.2mm, and the reason I'm pulling this one up when I'm talking about Iwata is because in fact this is made in exactly the same factory as the Iwata airbrushes, and a lot of the parts are interchangeable, and you can see just at the first glance they're very similar in construction and finish. This one also, take the front off, has that same very fine, very delicate nozzle. The great thing about the Eclipse that we're reviewing in this video is that the front is constructed a little bit differently, and I think a little bit more practically for day-to-day use in modelling. So first of all, have a look at the spanner there. You can see the spanner is quite a bit bigger. Here we've got a point where we can undo the front of the airbrush, and if I wind that out, we can see the construction is quite a bit different. So let me just put that there, and I'm going to use the Tamiya one just because it looks a bit similar, and it is the same mechanism basically as the Iwata anyway. You can see the very fine tip there, and I have to undo that. On this one, the whole front comes out. So there's the very fine nozzle, but it's actually been attached to this extra brass piece. So if I need to clean out the nozzle, I can just take this piece out. I can still readily get access to it, so I can clean it out, no problem at all. But I don't risk having to undo that and potentially damage it. In fact, Iwata don't want you to undo that. They actually sell this whole piece as one part if you need to replace it. But the fact that they've designed it like this, I think, dramatically reduces the risk that you're ever going to need a spare part. And for me, that alone makes the Eclipse a much better airbrush for day-to-day use in modelling. Just while I've got the front off too, by the way, the needle guard's exactly the same part as the other two airbrushes I've got here. So, the other benefit of having this separate piece coming off here is if you want to, you can remove the needle from the front of the airbrush. That's something you just can't do with these other designs from Iwata. So, if I take that out for a moment and just loosen that off, what I can do is basically push the needle through from the front. So if I've got a lot of paint on there, that I need to clean, I don't have to drag the needle all the way through the body and potentially put all that paint through the back of the airbrush. I can just pull the airbrush forward, needle forward, sorry, give it a clean and then put it back in. And that's a really great advantage as well. So let me just, it also means I don't have to fill around with this either, which is nice. This can stay in place because that's a separate part obviously and will come out if there isn't a needle in place. So we'll just put that back in, like so. And we'll tighten it up. So I think that feature really makes this airbrush a lot more practical. Let's tighten that up. Now, earlier on, when we were talking about the instructions, I mentioned that this includes a couple of features that aren't included with the airbrush, and that's the preset knob and the Mac valve. And there's not much we can do about the Mac valve, but I've found a really handy feature when it comes to this preset knob, because indeed it doesn't come on the end of the Eclipse airbrush. However, I also happen to own a Tamiya HG SF airbrush, which, as I said earlier, is made by the same company as Iwata. And what I've discovered is I can take the back end off my Tamiya, and it is, let's wind that back a bit. There we go. That doesn't feel like it's sitting right. There we go. And we'll do here. It's a perfect fit for the back of the Eclipse end. So if you've got a Tamiya airbrush, there's something to note, and if you've got another Iwata airbrush with this control on the back, the chances are you'll be able to swap the backs over if you need them. It's not a feature you use every day. Sometimes it's handy, and for those times it is handy, I now have a way that I can do it. Alright, so that's pretty much the overview of the airbrush itself. It's, as I said, it's an Iwata. It's very high quality. Unfortunately, I can't give you much of a guide to how well this operates, but I can tell you that trigger is absolutely lovely. So what we're going to do next is do a bit of a test spray with it. Okay, so I've got my compressor up and going, and I'm running the compressor at about 24 psi. And the paint I'm going to be using for this test is some Extreme Metal AK471 black base, which is just the gloss black base that they sell already pre-mixed for airbrush for using with their metallics. It's enamel based. Let's put a bit in the airbrush there. Okay, let's do a test spray. All seems to be good. So what we're going to do to start with is I'm going to leave it on this 24 psi. I'm going to see what kind of lines we can get from it, and I'm just spraying onto the back of an old breakfast cereal box. Okay, so you can see there, not too bad. That would be fine for a lot of tanks and planes. Okay, so that's the lines at 23, 24 psi. Let's see how we go for a bit of broader coverage. Now I've got it all the way back. So I'm actually moving the airbrush a bit further away from the cardboard because I don't need it to be that close. And that's working just great. Alright, so that's that. Let's come back in a moment. We're going to lower the air pressure to about 14 psi and we'll try again. Okay, so I've lowered the air pressure and I've refilled the airbrush. Let's try doing some more fine lines this time at the lower pressure and see how we go. Just going to take the nozzle guard off for a moment. Okay, so that's about as fine a line as I can get. Now, the cardboard does absorb the paint a little bit, so it is a little bit sort of smudged, but I'm not really going to blame the airbrush for that because I think that's just the material that I'm using to spray on. But it's not too bad at all. And the main thing is just how controllable that was. There was no problem at all with me using the needle to achieve that, and I think that's really important from our point of view as modelers as far as our confidence. If we're confident in the airbrush, we tend to do a better job than if we aren't certain about how the airbrush is going to respond. The Eclipse works really well in that respect. Now that we've got it on the low air pressure as well, around the 14 psi, let's see how we go with our coverage test. Well, as you expect, it's a little bit softer, but I've got to say that was actually easier to control. I think if you're trying to mist on 2 or 3 light coats so you didn't obscure any detail on your models, I think that would be absolutely fine. So for our last test, we're going to come back and do our mock camouflage fill-in and see how well we can control the airbrush. Okay, so I've got my pen here, and I'm just going to draw a couple of squiggly lines and see how well we can paint between the lines like we might on a camouflage pattern for an aircraft or something like that. If you're doing something like an exhaust on an aircraft or something like that, the control I'm getting at the moment is absolutely spot on. This would be more than good enough for that kind of work. Okay, it passed that test with flying colours. It was so easy to control, very confidence inspiring the way that the actual trigger works. It's very smooth, very accurate. Couldn't really ask for more with an airbrush, to be perfectly honest. It was really good. Let's just try the writing now. So I'm just going to try and write my name. Let's take the needle guard off again and see if we can do that a little bit finer and a little bit closer. And it is finer. So look, for 99% of what we do in modelling, I think this airbrush would be absolutely fine. If I'm honest, I think the Tamiya airbrush, the 0.2, is slightly better, which you would expect because it's got a finer needle, but it's not that much better. So if you've only got the funds to go and buy one good airbrush, and you're thinking about an Iwata, I would say this is the perfect airbrush. Simple to clean, good size needle that gives you coverage, but also the fine lines for your camouflages and your weathering and that kind of thing. And it's really nice to use. Very nice to use and very controllable, which is what you want, because that's going to boost your confidence with the airbrush, which inevitably means you're going to do a much better job on your models. So there you go. That's the Iwata Eclipse HP-CS. Really, really nice airbrush, good quality. I won't talk about the price. Iwata's fairly expensive, I guess. They're not cheap airbrushes, but I have seen these on eBay, for example, with quite varying prices. So if you keep an eye out for them, they do come up at a reasonable price. I actually paid only a few dollars more than my Tamiya HG airbrush for the Iwata brand. And I think this one is just a really good all-rounder with that needle that's easy to clean, good size cup that you can use for broad painting and as well as detail work, and just the Iwata quality. Highly recommended. I got a feeling this will become my go-to airbrush for a lot of different applications that I work with. Thanks for watching the review, and we'll catch you on the next one.